All set?
I think I'm all set. Yes.
Great.
Okay. Right.
בוקר טוב. Yeah. You can have a seat. Yeah, okay. בוקר טוב. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to open this outreach lecture that comes after what I just heard, a very, very successful workshop. So congratulations for this part. And it's really my pleasure and honor to have Professor Carolin Bynum as our speaker for today in the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. I will leave Dror Varman to say a few words about Carolin, but just I couldn't resist reading a little bit, as you can imagine, and I just want to mention just the following her milestones in her career makes her, I'm sure, a role model for many young men and women. Really a beautiful, rich, and exciting career that I'm sure, I don't know why I'm saying this, but I'm sure that it opens a lot of doors for new faculties, for really as inspiration for others. So just one fact from their biography, that she was the first woman, at least, to be appointed as a university professor at Columbia, and I think it says something. And I'll skip all the very interesting career later on. So it's a special honor, and I'm really delighted that Carolin is also a recipient of the honorary doctorate of philosophy of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for this year. So Mazal Tov, congratulations, brachot. I will take a minute to say something on this institute and maybe even one word about myself. I'm Michal Inyal. I'm the director of the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies in the last 2.5 years. It seems like endless, but it was just now. I'm a biologist myself. I'm a molecular and computational biologist and a neuroscientist in training. And I've discovered during these 2.5 years that one of the most pleasant and quite exciting aspect of this position is really to be able to welcome these very special events. And as you can imagine, we have quite a lot of them. And often I take the opportunity to learn something about this. So I just, and to expand my own horizon beyond my own profession. And, just a month ago, we had a meeting on the cult of the Southern Levant in the Greco-Roman period. And immediately after, we learned about the art and text and inscription and archaeology, which is just the tool to do what we are trying to do in all those fields, which really understanding human culture, human nature, human in general. And I cannot resist just say that last a few days ago we finished a meeting, a very exciting meeting on ancient DNA. And I mention this because it's exactly what this institute is all about, bringing in people from very different disciplines, anthropologists, a curator of museums, a geneticist, people from doing domestication of animals, of wine. Which one is the first wine that was in the biblical time in Israel, and they found it, and now they are growing it, actually. So we can taste what the Roman and people were tasting. So it's really exciting. And what I want to mention is that in the as a summary, that I feel that maybe as a neuroscientist and biologist, and also we are doing ancient DNA stuff, it's all coming to one aspect, which is really seeking knowledge and seeking to understand human nature, human behavior, human culture, and I think this is a good start to just pass the torch to Dror. But before finishing, as you can see, that this is a very beautiful hall, and we have a unbelievable nice place. But I want to take a minute to say what it is, this Institute for Advanced Studies, that maybe some of you are not familiar with. It's not just this good food, and it's more than that. And the idea is really very simple in few words. Just the idea is to bring in new ideas, to plant and to encourage innovative thinking, and sometimes to formulate innovative thinking that must be coming from different unexpected direction, and our job is just not to interfere in this. That's all. So just to sit aside and let it just happen. And so I encourage you maybe to come later and to ask me, what do I mean by that, and how can we apply and may be part of this. And it's not very complicated, but I leave it a little bit as an appetizer, just to so that you can come and ask more, and of course all the information in our web. So again, thank you so much for being here on Friday with this exciting, and Dror, I invite you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Dror Valman. I'm the Dean of the Humanities, though I think I'm here more in the quality of historian to introduce Carolin Bynum. But first let me thank Michal Neal for hosting this event on a Friday, which is not a trivial thing, because this institution usually is not open on a Friday, so you had to actually bring staff here and do all this work for us. So thank you, Michal. And I also want to thank Elisheva Baumgarten, who set up this event, as well as Tami Herzig, who was involved in setting up the this morning's workshop. And I started with the thanks. I should have ended with them, but I also want to thank everybody for coming. I see here people, I see here students, the graduate students that already met Carolin this morning and know more about her than what I'm about to say now. Undergraduates, I see here faculty from several different institutions, so thank you all for coming. So as I said, I think my role here really, I'm qualified to the extent that I am, because I'm a historian myself, and in the generation in which I went to graduate school, one of the most significant new developments in the writing of history was the beginnings of gender history, not just as women's history, or her story as it was called then, but gender as a category, gender as a category related to other categories, as a category that permeates as a fundamental category most historical questions, even when they're not directly related, or at least they don't seem at first related to questions of men and women or sex. There was also much interest in the question of gender versus sex and relationship of sex and bodies. And some people took that and then went on and talked about bodies, not as just about sex, but bodies in a more broader sense. And in all of those developments, Carolin Walker Bynum was not just one of the most important pioneers, but also one of the very best and most creative practitioners in all of that. I should say, I kind of, my path crossed with, or I met Carolin's scholarship in two very important moments in my kind of development as a historian. The first one actually was my first year in graduate school, when her famous Holy Feast and Holy Fast just came out, and we were students of Natalie Zeman Davis. We all read it the moment it came off the press. It's a book about women's piety, about women's bodies, about what the connections are between female religiosity and gender norms in society. So we all read this with great excitement, and then Carolin came to speak at Princeton. She came to speak and gave one of the most beautiful talks I've ever heard since then as well. It began with a story that was not medieval at all. It was actually about a 20th century British woman, Rebecca West, and I remember this, as I told you, almost 20-something years later, as a most striking way to open a talk. The story was taken from the memoirs of Rebecca West. It was how, that's at least the way I remember this. I hope I'm not kind of mangling it too badly, but it was about how Rebecca West, as a young child, was burying or digging up chestnuts in the courtyard, in the yard where she was living, and her father comes to her and says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "I'm God, and I've killed people. These are people, and I've killed them, and now I'm resurrecting them, bringing them back to life." And her father looks at her and says, "Why don't you just leave them alone?" At which point the kid says, "They would be fine with this, but it wouldn't be very fun for me." And with this story, Carolin started a talk about the resurrection of the body. And this became a book about the resurrection of the body. And what does it mean when you actually take resurrection of the body seriously? That means it's not just about immortal souls, but actually there's something somatic about the connection between souls and real bodies and actual bodies. And that book came out later. But as a first-year graduate student, I didn't quite get all the intellectual depth of this talk. I think what I really got out of this, and stayed with me ever since, is that history is a rhetorical art. That what we do, it depends so much on how we present it. And that was really a model that I always went back to and thought, wow, that's how it should be done. History is not quite just a science. Where's Michal? She shouldn't hear this. But really is a rhetorical art. The second time your work really came and influenced mine in a very deep way was when I found myself many years later writing about gender identity and realizing that much of what I was writing was really not about gender identity as such, but rather about personal identity and identity itself. And as I was trying to figure this out, I realized that in a completely different field, maybe somebody's already done this. And the closest, actually, I think, to this day, I think the closest book in the sense that encapsulated much of what I was thinking was Carolin's book, Metamorphosis and Identity, which took around the year, so the 12th, 13th century, and looked at questions of personal identity and change, and really did amazing things way before anybody else was looking at them, starting with things like werewolves and commentaries on Ovid and the theology of the Eucharist, and combining all these to a really powerful argument about things that I cared about very much then, and really ended up informing my thinking very deeply. So this very short introduction, which I'm about to bring to an end, isn't quite the conventional bio of reading you all of Carolin's achievements. So I did not mention things like the MacArthur Fellowship or being the president of the American Historical Association, which I do actually remember very vividly, or being, Michal already mentioned this, this is something that is related so deeply to her work in a way, the first woman who was a university professor at Columbia, then she was a dean there, which now I sympathize with more than I used to. But I will stop here just by saying it's a huge honor, Carolin, to have you here. And I want everybody please join me in welcoming Carolin Walker Bynum.
Okay, whoops, yes, okay. We've had a little preview of what's coming. Thank you so much. I've had a wonderful, I've been coming to Israel since 2000. I've always had a wonderful time. And the highlights have always been the workshops that Elisheva and Michael Head used to organize, and now Elisheva and Tommy Herzig, and they've been wonderful. The energy, the intelligence, the creativity of graduate students and faculty here is just enormously impressive. And so I thank you for now letting me become an alumna of the Hebrew University, which will then be a very special status that I shall treasure. So thank you very much. I begin with a paradox. Our best evidence for the use of medieval Christian art, that is what most of us think of as Catholic art, is in Protestant Germany. In Saxony, Lower Saxony, and Mecklenburg alone, over 700 medieval altarpieces survive in their churches. There are more medieval mass chalices and ecclesiastical vestments extant today from northern Germany than from any place else. Such chalices, altar linens, and altarpieces are not, for the most part, preserved in display cases or in museums. They are used in ritual. Whereas in Catholic areas of southern Germany, medieval works of art and church furnishings have often been plastered over by Baroque ornamentation or removed entirely from sanctuaries, Protestant Germany is rich in medieval church decoration. Given the recent attention by art historians to the iconoclasm of 16th and 17th century Calvinists and Puritans in Northern Europe, which targeted material objects such as vestments and altar rails as much as images, this evidence of artistic and liturgical survival in Protestant lands comes as a surprise. In other words, most of us assume that Protestants were all about image smashing. The survival of medieval art is particularly in Protestant areas. Several socio-economic and political explanations can be proposed for the paradox of Protestant survivals, and we can discuss some of them in the question period after my lecture if you wish. But this morning I want to talk about the theological explanation that's been given for such survival because it leads us to focus on the objects themselves. In the only recent scholarly discussion of what German historians have called the preserving power of Lutheranism, the explanation for such survival has been Luther's doctrine of adiaphora, or things of indifference. Now, a word of explanation. When the reformer Martin Luther returned to Wittenberg in 1522, after posting the 95 Theses in 1517, he found that damage had been wreaked on church art under the leadership of a fellow reformer, Andreas Karlstadt. Horrified, he argued against such actions. Iconoclasm is objectionable, he said, exactly because nobody really believes a statue is God. Objects are adiaphora, things of indifference. While it would be better to do without them, simple people who need them should not be scandalized or indeed led by the animus against images to attach to them too much importance. If images and objects, altars and church buildings instruct the devout and provide space for the hearing of the word, they do no harm, precisely because no sacrality inheres in them. Religious pictures are neither holy nor unholy. They're merely there to be used. The idea of adiaphora led almost immediately to controversy among Protestants, who disagreed about which practices might be indifferent or non-essential. Indeed, the fact that over the next 200 years there was more than one adiaphorous controversy suggests some inherent difficulties in the concept. But what I want to suggest this morning is that the whole idea is hard to accept. Are religious materials themselves inert or indifferent, waiting for words from the pulpit or the Sunday school to imbue them with meaning? The doctrine of indifference did allow Lutheran pastors and princes to retain objects by asserting new meanings for them, but it hardly seems a very good description of what people actually saw. I want today to use the case of the Protestant Reformation to argue not only that religious objects carry stories and practices with them, but also that they can force us to consider anew the nature and dating of cultural change. At the moment, this matters practically as well as theoretically, because the German press is very busy, and German offices of tourism too, trying to prepare for what is being called the Lutherjahr of 2017. That is the 500th anniversary of Luther's posting of the 95 Theses, long denominated in textbooks the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. But what would the story look like if we considered things rather than text? Now, to give a survey of 16th century religious history in Northern Europe is beyond a short talk. But I hope to suggest an answer to this question, or at least to soften our tendency to rely mostly on texts in periodizing religious history, by considering three examples from what are today Protestant areas. one from a Lutheran church in the south of Germany, and 2 from Protestant women's convents in the north. My southern example is the Riemenschneider altar of Rottenburg ob der Tauber. And here you can see where, first of all, over there on the far right, you can see where Bavaria is within Germany, and here you can see within Bavaria where Rottenburg is. In the 3rd quarter of the 15th century, the Church of St. Jakob in Rottenburg was expanded, and the valuable relic of the blood of Christ was rehoused in a shrine at the west end of the church. In the center of this shrine, a winged altarpiece by the famous sculptor Tilman Riemenschneider was installed between 1502 and 1505. This is the famous Riemenschneider altar. At the stipulation of the donor, the central panel depicted the Last Supper with Judas as the central figure. There you can see Christ giving the sop to Judas. A Lutheran preacher was installed in Rottenburg in the early 1520s. The city then returned to Catholicism briefly twice, once after a revolt in 1525 and again after the interim imposed by the emperor in 1548. It received its own Protestant church ordinance in 1559. In 1582, the altarpiece was closed and the outside wings were partly painted over. At some point, the monstrance for the Eucharistic wafer, which was located in the center of Riemenschneider's predella, was replaced by a crucifix. So you can see originally there was a monstrance here for the communion host, and that's then been replaced by a crucifix. Unlike some late medieval altarpieces, the Riemenschneider altar is monochrome. Most medieval altarpieces are very brightly painted. We saw an example earlier. This is not painted. This is a fact which the art historian Michael Baxtendall saw as foreshadowing the plain style of Protestant churches. Joseph Kerner has argued that focusing Last Supper depictions on the sop given to Judas might seem a particularly Protestant emphasis. It seems to put the individual conscience first, inducing the viewer to ask, am I sinning? Am I perpetuating the crucifixion? Because of these artistic emphases and foci, the Riemenschneider altar has sometimes been seen as Protestant before the Reformation. But in the 16th century, the Riemenschneider altar was known as the Holy Blood altar. And throughout the century, whatever modifications were made in the predella and wings, the crystal reliquary with Christ's precious blood above shimmered above the monochrome carving or shadowed wings. So here is the crystal reliquary, which was always there and a prominent focus of devotion. The reliquary is still there today, although its contents have disintegrated or disappeared. How then do we date the coming of the Reformation in Rottenburg? A simple chronology might date its beginnings to the arrival of the first Lutheran preacher in the 1520s, the first Lutheran Eucharist in 1544, or the acquisition of the church ordinance in 1559. But throughout all the changes, the blood relic sparkled above the western altar. And we know that 200 citizens of Rottenburg objected to the reformer Karlstadt's interpretation of the Eucharist as radically spiritual. In 1524, they signed a protest that claimed that Christ was physically present in the Eucharist. Quote, all Christ-believing persons have received and enjoyed his tender Corpus Christi and his rose-colored blood under the form of bread and wine at least once a year. What chronology of religious change then should we adopt? Should we see a reformation of sensibility beginning with a monochrome altarpiece that emphasizes individual conscience? Do we date the start of a new religion to a particular piece of legislation? Or do we emphasize rather the insistent presence above all this of the sort of relic Luther himself steadfastly opposed, and see in that relic a precondition for the citizen's conviction that Christ can be corporally present in church ritual? We can never know what the people of Rottenburg thought they were seeing, but the visual persistence of the relic suggests a different course of development from a study of text. Visually and physically present, the blood of Christ endured. I turn now to two examples from Cloister Wienhausen, one of 6 communities of Protestant nuns in the Lüneburg Heath in Lower Saxony, today supervised by a state authority. And here you see Lower Saxony. Wienhausen is located just here, as you can see, south of Hamburg, northeast of Hanover. A backwater in the 21st century, the Lüneburg Heath was anything but in the medieval period, and Wienhausen was the ducal house cloister. Founded as a monastery for nuns in the 1520s, affiliated with but not incorporated into the Cistercians, Wienhausen was reformed in 1469 according to the observant reform emanating from Windesheim. Although Wienhausen's buildings and properties were partly destroyed in the middle 16th century by the efforts of Duke Ernest the Confessor to impose the Lutheran Reformation, Wienhausen survived, like other nunneries in the area, changing only slowly over the course of the next 2 centuries. Today, the women's houses of the Lüneburg Heath, securely Protestant in commitment, work to preserve the cultural heritage of the area. Wienhausen itself boasts an extraordinarily rich collection of medieval weavings made by the nuns, secular as well as religious in subject, a large number of statues. There are 3 examples. I'll come back to one of them. A remarkable collection of small devotional objects discovered under the choir stalls in 1953. Here are 2 examples of devotional objects, little medallions made by the nuns, paper mache, pushed in a mold, and then each nun can individually color hers the way she wants to color it, and then hang them in the cells for devotion. I'll come back to these. An extensive painting in the vault of the nuns' choir. This richness makes Wienhausen the place where historians, the devout, and the curious public can best see the art of the Middle Ages unchanged and in situ. I begin with the large and lavishly decorated Holy Sepulchre, located today in the nuns' choir, the largest freestanding wooden structure of this type extant. It houses a figure of Christ made about 1290. Known today as the Grave Christ, but called by the nuns in the Middle Ages the Holy Body, the Christ figure is flat and hollow. It was probably carried in performance in the Middle Ages, although today it's bolted into its sarcophagus. That sarcophagus, commissioned in 1448 by Wienhausen's aristocratic abbess, received from the bishop an indulgence of 40 days, offered to anyone who visited it or made offerings to the chapel where it was located. We know that the chapel where the grave Christ stood was shared with the laity. One side connected to the nuns' chapter house, the other to the parish church through a small opening. Although the introduction of the observant reform to Wienhausen in 1469 tried to de-emphasize contact between the nuns and the laity and enforce stricter enclosure, this was clearly not very successful. In 1483, a visitation criticized the nuns for opening the doors of their church to show off their devotional objects. Several of the little prayer cards made by the nuns themselves depict devotion to the Holy Sepulchre. And in a stained glass window that echoes the motif, we see a little nun herself praying in front of the grave. And one of the interesting things about this window is you can see that the laying of Christ in the tomb is not just a historical or narrative event, it's a depiction of their own devotional object, with one of themselves praying in front of it. Scholars who've worked extensively on Wienhausen and its objects argue that the grave Christ, in conjunction with the figure of the resurrected Christ made at the same time, was used to enact the death and burial of Christ on Good Friday and his resurrection on Easter Day, a ritual performance particularly important to religious women because of the role of women as witnesses to the resurrection. In the 1520s, Duke Ernest the Confessor, the local duke, attempted to introduce Lutheran practices by force. Relic veneration was forbidden, and then or later some of the devotional figures had their relics removed. But change came very slowly. The nuns resisted communion in 2 kinds and avoided the suppression of hymns to Mary until the late 1530s. Catholic abbesses were elected until 1587. The Cistercian habit was put off only in 1616. The Latin office continued until 1620, and as late as 1722, that is the 18th century, we find the Prince Elector of Hanover still trying to get the nuns to stop dressing their statues with clothes and jewelry, especially the Virgin Mary, which of course would have horrified Luther. When the grave Christ was opened in 1863 for restoration, its relics, some from 1290, some from 1370, some from 1450, were still in place. Down to today, the sisters have private and richly decorated individual cells, despite efforts of reformers, both observant and Protestant, to enforce greater communality of life. Archival material suggests that the nuns continued well into the 16th century to make for themselves little images and hang these in their cells for private use. These are two examples that I showed before. And the fact that you have the thong there for hanging it up means it was hung on the wall, and so people were meditating and saying prayers before it. It wasn't just simply a private object carried around. When the 16th century reformers tried to change the nuns' understanding of their ritual and objects, the sisters actively objected to new interpretations. They prayed with their rosaries when forced to listen to Protestant sermons. So Protestant came in to preach from the pulpit, and the nuns sat there and told their beads. Later, when they were denied the office in Latin, they were told they couldn't have the office in Latin anymore, it had to be in the vernacular. They listened, and then they retreated to the refectory, and they sang the office in Latin over lunch. And despite the fact that the collecting of indulgences fell away in the 16th century, the grave Christ continued to be visited. Its religious significance endured, even as its artistic significance, as the oldest large figure of its type in Germany, became increasingly more apparent. In 1862, that is, in the late 19th century, when all the cloisters of the region were requested to send artwork to the new museum founded in Hanover by King George V, Wynhausen was asked to surrender the grave Christ as a very important artistic object. But the abbess refused. Her argument suggests how long religious observance can survive. She argued that the object could not be moved because the peasants of the parish, according to an old tradition, had the right to come into the chapter, go to the chapter room, and say a silent Pater Noster, that is an Our Father, before the holy grave located there. A holy grave that still had its relics, much of its 15th century decoration, and traces of anointing by generation upon generation of sisters and laity. When then did the Reformation come to Wynhausen? I may seem so far simply to be arguing that religious change comes slowly. But I'm also suggesting something else. That is that objects themselves often tell a different and more labile and confused story than that told by text. We can date quite precisely Duke Ernest's prohibition of Latin and relics, indulgences, and devotion to Mary, as we can date the church ordinance of Rottenburg. We can say when the first pastor with a Lutheran affiliation arrived in various cities in Germany. But it is harder to date the endurance or attenuation of the power of the blood relic in the Riemenschneider altar, or the sacrality given by the grave Christ to space for saying the Our Father. Objects may tell their own story, particularly in Germany, where the definition of religious affiliation was usually dictated by prince or patriciate, not populace. We may need to look to objects for evidence about what people were really doing religiously. I turn then to another set of objects from Wynhausen. This is my final example. Statues and their clothes, a large collection of which survives and has been technically analyzed in a catalog, Heilige Röcke, Holy Dresses, published just 2 years ago in 2013. My point is not only to argue that they provide evidence of continuity of practice long beyond what religious legislation might suggest. It is also to demonstrate that such evidence, if carefully considered, carries its own story about devotional life, one which contradicts in certain ways recent generalizations about medieval and early modern piety. Here are some examples of the dresses, and you can see very nicely the one for the Madonna has a bigger slit for the left-hand arm so that the baby can go through as well as the arm. The material itself of the saints' dresses, brocade that can be documented to come from a period between the 14th and 16th centuries, indicates that most were made between 1469 and 1587. And the Wienhausen necrology, begun in 1474, records many donations of clothing, usually made by women, some of it explicitly for the saints. So in other words, a woman during her lifetime or when she dies will give her best dress to Wienhausen, not for the nuns or for them to sort of cut up into altar clothes, but for the saints, so that Mary, she's giving her dress to Mary. Surviving inventories make it clear that the statue's garments were used until the early 18th century. Moreover, the clothes were sometimes labeled to indicate for which figure they're intended. This is a little label which says it's the fourth tunic for the angels. Moreover, they were labeled to say whether they're for ordinary day or feast days. Obviously, these angels had at least 4 different outfits according to where you are in the liturgical year. This also means that any member of the community, guided by the labels, could dress the statues for worship. The dressing and bejeweling of the saints was a communal act that linked the sisters in a tactile fashion to the saints they continued to revere despite Lutheran strictures against this. But do these clothes tell us anything more than that older practices survived down into the 18th century? I argue that they do, and this is my final point. To put it a little baldly, the story we are usually told is that by the 15th century, Christian devotion, especially female devotion, was mired in suffering and blood, and a piety that concentrated on inducing a guilt against which works must be accumulated, not on accepting the liberation of offered salvation. The Protestant Reformation was then, among other things, a reaction against this, against guilt, works, and acts. The little dresses at Wienhausen and the bodies they dressed, like the shimmering salvific blood at Rottenburg, suggest a different and more nuanced account. At Wienhausen and the other women's houses in northern Germany, we find throughout the 14th to the 17th century a very active piety of works, a sense of the glory of the resurrection, and a confident hope of heaven, all of which are celebrated in the dresses and jewels of the saints. Now, there was, of course, devotion to the suffering Christ at Wienhausen, but the iconography of ceiling vaults, windows, and lanterns stresses triumph and glory more than sacrifice and expiation. Moreover, the nuns saw their own clothes as signs of espousal and foretaste of glory, paralleling the clothes of the Virgin Queen in heaven. They wore the Cistercian habit and the nun's crown that was part of it until the 17th century, long after they'd been forced to accept a Lutheran convent head. The importance of the glorious clothing with which the nuns dressed their statues in themselves is clear if we consider the devotional figure of the resurrected Christ made around 1290 at the same time as the grave Christ. Our knowledge that it was dressed gives a new interpretation to much of the debate about it conducted by art historians over the past 60 years. Although the statue has clothes carved on it, it has a prominent side wound through which a tiny hole is bored. Here's the side wound, and there's a little hole that goes through the wound. Historians have debated whether it was a sacrament house or a tabernacle to contain a monstrance for the host, perhaps paired on the high altar with Wienhausen's blood relic. The debates involved all sorts of technical questions about sacrament houses that I'm not going to go into here. But what we learn from the recent study of holy dresses is that the statue was clothed. It was clothed with a green dress and stood most of the time on the altar dressed, where from the light on one side of the dress indicates that it stood on the altar, so we can actually see where it stood because we can see how the light came in and has faded it on one side, so we know that it wasn't just put on and taken off. It stood there for a while, and this green robe, of course, makes the wound completely invisible. So the notion that there was this sort of obsession with wound and blood and this kind of thing now that somebody studied these clothes and we looked at them and we realized that the statue was dressed, we see we have to interpret things a little bit differently. This suggests caution about interpreting the statue as a monstrance for the Eucharistic host and downplays the role of blood and devotion in its veneration. Moreover, we have several little prayer cards from Wienhausen that depict the statue in its green dress. And depictions of the resurrection that are in fact depictions of this statue abound at Wienhausen, on lanterns, on little wall plaques, in the stained glass, and on the ceiling. And here are just a few examples. So they show, among other things, the statue obviously had more than one dress because we see it dressed in different colors. And also there are just numerous, there are, in the 20s, examples of this kind of depiction at Wienhausen, which shows that all this emphasis on, kind of suffering and expiation, when the nuns were looking all the time at this image of triumph, is a little bit off. Sometimes, as in this 14th century glass here, the wound isn't depicted at all. The Christ is completely dressed. Sometimes the wound's depicted but not emphasized. Sometimes in this little prayer card made by one of the nuns with all the instructions for how you pray, yes, there's the wound, but it's golden. It looks like a diamond. It looks like a jewel. It doesn't really look like a wound. So if we consider the material and visual evidence, the emphasis in Wienhausen devotion is at least as much on the glory as on the suffering of Christ. So this example, just one example that I'm talking about, suggests not only a continuity of spirituality at Wienhausen through the reforms of both the 15th and 16th century, but also that conventional descriptions of that spirituality may not be correct for either century. Not only is the resurrected Christ at Wienhausen not indifferent, he seems to induce and perpetuate a piety that is not the fixation on suffering, often attributed to the late Middle Ages, but rather a sense of glory, triumph, and active piety to which historians need to pay more attention. In conclusion, then, a return to the paradox with which I began. The question of why Catholic objects survive down to today in Protestant lands, and indeed why they have recently in some areas been emphasized as the locus of pilgrimage or religious retreats. These things are doing a thriving business in people coming from all over. It's a complicated question, and answering it necessitates investigating details of local history that differ from region to region. But whatever reasons we give, it is clear that the theological doctrine of adiaphora does not provide a sufficient explanation. In other words, what Lutheran scholars, and particularly Lutheran pastors, have argued, Lutheran theology sort of explains why we have all this survival, is clearly not sufficient. Yes, the doctrine of adiaphora enabled pastors to use and reuse valuable medieval objects, such as altars, vestments, and liturgical vessels, exactly because they could maintain that the meaning of the objects was not fixed. Nonetheless, attention to the objects themselves suggests that they're not really indifferent. Objects such as the crystal reliquary and the Riemenschneider altar and the statue of the resurrected Christ at Wienhausen do not merely survive. They carry with them past devotion. They create and maintain space for piety. Although we can never know exactly what worshipers have in their hearts as they worship, and perhaps they don't even know sometimes themselves, we have evidence from what people do that objects such as the grave Christ at Wienhausen and the crystal at St. Jacob's in Rottenburg shaped response. The materiality of objects carries forward the experience of people in the past, that carrying capacity, the way objects transmit piety and story, should complicate both our generalizations about chronology and our tendency to privilege text, especially theological text, in our accounts of religious history. Thank you. And I was told the most important thing was to be 30 minutes, so that was 30 minutes, right? Did you want discussion? Yeah, okay, questions? Yeah?
I would like to ask, how do you see these small objects
Yeah, this is, of course, a very complicated question. This is interesting, as I mentioned. In 1953, that when they excavated under the nun stalls, they found absolutely the most incredible collection of things. Among them, actually had a slide of this, the oldest examples of extant eyeglasses in the world. These are this rivet eyeglasses which are found under the choir stalls. That's extremely interesting because there were lots and lots of eyeglasses. So why are the nuns' eyeglasses? Which shows, they were literate and all kinds of things, but also why are there eyeglasses under the stalls? There has been a lot of discussion. Was this deliberate? Were they hidden away at the time of either of the reforms? Some of the things clearly were hidden away. There's for example, this is well known, there's a mandrake under there. So obviously somebody was conjuring with a mandrake, and at some point this had to be hidden. On the other hand, a lot of the things clearly just dropped between the slats. There's an enormous amount of sewing material, which suggests to me that the sisters, while they're saying the office, were also sewing. And I think one of the things they were doing, they were making both elegant robes for themselves, because they did not simply wear the Cistercian garb. They were also making these clothes for statues. But we have tremendous of pearls and sequins and little gold jewels and threads and thimbles and all kinds of things. So a lot of it clearly just fell between the cracks. And these small devotional objects. The really important thing about it for us is that we have more of this stuff than we have from any place else. But since there were the excavations at Wienhausen, they've now looked under the floors of a number of other convents and are beginning to find the same kind of thing. So this is enormously important evidence. Some of it clearly was hidden, and some, like the mandrake, and some of it probably had anthropopaic meaning. In other words, there probably was a kind of superstition, a kind of conjuring with some of these things. At least one theory about the eyeglasses has been that glasses sort of represent the person, and that when the nun died, many of them are broken. And so that this may have been the nun as a person with her glasses hidden under the choir stalls. The choir stalls are obviously sacred space. And so if you put something which sort of stands for the person there, it might be a kind of sort of burying it in sacred space. On the other hand, you're not burying your thimble. You're not burying a few sequins that you were sewing on a dress. Basically, we don't have textual evidence and we don't know. Although we do have a lot of textual fragments under the floor, including part of a liturgy for this Good Friday, Easter Sunday ritual, which we wouldn't know about at all before. We also have, I don't have a picture of it here, but actually we have in the dresses, because in the reforms of the 1460s, where the nuns were forced to go back to Latin from a vernacular culture, a lot of the vernacular documents which they had were then used as stiffening in the dresses. So we have actually had the survival of vernacular text as petticoats in the dresses for the statues, some of which are large enough fragments that we can retrieve material we wouldn't have otherwise. So my answer is a lot, I think, survives simply by accident, but there clearly was, and there are some relic bundles, and some important relic bundles. Those may very well have been hidden at the time of the repression, really, of certain aspects of worship by the Protestants. Yeah?
All the examples that you brought were Christological, and I wonder whether there were also survivals of cults of saints.
Yes. Definitely. And indeed, one of the, actually, what did I have? I had Mary and Christ, and then I had the foundress, Agnes. But there's a significant saint cult, and you find again that reflected in the lanterns. And we have dresses for the saints, but it's interesting that most of the dresses that we have are either for Jesus figures, we have some little tiny ones, so that you dress the mother, and then the arm would come through, and you have a little dress for the baby, whose outfit may match his mother's or may not, depending. But we do have some dresses for the saints, and the donations that we have listed in the necrology are often a jewel for Saint so-and-so. Saint Maurice was an important saint. So yes, definitely was saint cult one of the things, of course, that would have upset Luther very much is the extent to which it continues to be a Marian cult. Yeah.
Thank you for that very rich lecture, and I hope you'll forgive a very simple question.
No.
But depending on the answer, it might lead to something more profound. Is there evidence of the statuary dresses before the late 15th century?
Yeah.
Going back as early as 1290?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think that the practice of dressing statues grows. I mean, I do think that there's a chronological shift in the direction. But we have some that are older. The problem, of course, is these things don't tend to survive because they decay. And if we have some evidence from all of these convents that in the problematic years of the 18th century, a number of them were sold. And in some of them, which had very elaborate and rich decoration, had lots of gold spangles and this kind of thing, the spangles were cut off and sold, although the dresses survive. So part of it is, and they're very fragile, and nobody had really worked on them until these two curators from Hanover said, oh, we got this collection, why don't we work on them? And they made mock-ups of all the little dresses in white linen so they could try them on the statues because they're too, fragile to try on the statues. So we know exactly which dress goes with which statue, and we also, some of them therefore suggest that there was statuary which no longer survives because it doesn't fit anything in the church. So there are some that are older, but most of them, the brocade is 15th and 16th century.
So I'm wondering what might account for that crescendo of dressing production and activity in the late 15th century.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure, and indeed, I'm not sure, as I said, sort of hesitantly, how much of a crescendo there is, simply because the problem of survival is so problematic. But I think, in general, what I'm trying to argue is that in the healthy times for these convents, not just for Wienhausen, but for this whole group of convents, and I think this is true even for German convents generally, there was much more of an emphasis on glory, on redemption, on display, if you will, than we have been inclined to think. And even some of the very recent literature on these places emphasizes devotion to suffering and this kind of thing, which is there. But I think when we look at this kind of evidence, when we look at the sort of statues that they were making well into the 16th century, where the statues, I've written another article about this, they have very elaborate crowns, and the women themselves wore elaborate crowns, which was criticized, but the nuns themselves dressed up. And the profession ceremony was a ceremony of being dressed and putting on crowns and putting on jewelry. I mean, when a girl came in, she was often given a Jesus doll, and some of these were made out of silver, some of these were very expensive. And then they came with their own wardrobes. Some of these little girls came in at 4 or 5 years old. They were given their dolls, and then when they professed, they might be given another doll. And some of these were also statues of the saints. We weren't only just Jesus statues. So I think, and particularly in the reforms of the 1460s, which did issue in a tremendous cultural flowering, I think there was a tremendous sense of the importance of what the nuns were doing and of their affinity to Mary the Heavenly Queen, to Christ as the ruler, and that, I think, there's an emphasis in the spirituality that would suggest why elaborate and elegant dresses. But then there's also, and this is very important, these houses, especially Wienhausen, were endowed by the local aristocracy, and then by the late 15th and 16th centuries also by the patriciate. And so the most wealthy people in the neighborhood are giving, and you're not going to give, an old rag to put on the Virgin Mary. That isn't going to be, that's not going to bring honor to the ducal house. So you're going to give a very, very elegant dress for Mary, so you can say, that's what we gave. And we also, we also gave a widow, or we gave a daughter, she came in too, with appropriate financial support. So a certain amount of this, certainly in the late 15th century, has to do with the flowering. Then, of course, you have the question that there's not flowering in the middle of the 16th century, there's only survival. And why then the sisters hang on so to the practice of dressing. There, I think it's a hanging on to earlier devotion, and you may not be allowed to say the office the way you want, but you can still dress your statues, you can take them out in procession. So I think those things contribute. Yeah. Yeah, this is a very, very good question. And as you can see, almost everything that I talk about, I do need to bring in, some text to sort of bolster dating or whatever. So I'm certainly not arguing that we can get rid of text. Nobody would argue that. But I think what you suggest is really important, and that is that if you look at the objects, you may then go back to the text with new questions. So one thing I'd say is then you go back to the devotional text, particularly to the liturgical texts. And one of the things, we've discovered, people, not me, but a number of curators of archives in the north of Germany have discovered absolutely, wonderful stuff recently. Most of it hasn't even been edited. A lot of vernacular stuff as well as a lot of Latin stuff. And these texts themselves tell us about devotional objects. When we look at the devotional objects, when we go to the text, we begin to see, a lot of them are liturgical texts. So, we see the liturgy, but then when we see the objects that they were actually using in the liturgy, we see this is the statue that was being paraded around. If the host is buried in the grave Christ on Maundy Thursday and then resurrected at the altar on Sunday, we see the actual objects, that we're carrying the liturgy, then we begin to interpret the liturgy in a different way. We can finally begin to see the liturgy as living in a way that we need to see the liturgy, but it's very hard to do when you just have the dry text in front of you. You can imagine, and generally people have done work on, particularly late medieval women, visionaries, where they've actually tried to choreograph the kind of bodily movements that people may have gone through as they prayed. You can also do this, there's a lot of Dominican stuff about how people prayed, and if you can begin to choreograph how people were moving and moving with objects, then you can come to the text with a new kind of richness of the text as experiential. And then I'm also making the simpler argument that legislation which says, okay, we have a Lutheran pastor at this point. Well, we have a Lutheran pastor because the prince wanted to be Lutheran, and as you know, who's the region, here's the religion. And so, people had to be Lutheran one day, and then they might have to be Calvinist the next, and then they might go back to being Catholic, and then they might be Lutheran again because the authority said this is the kind of preacher you're going to have. What I'm suggesting is that what people are doing on the ground, we have to use that, to talk about legislative change. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So when we look after the Reformation at things like visitation records and things like that, is there a sort of continuous crackdown on this thing, or is it periods where suddenly somebody has a reforming zeal and cracks down, and the rest of the time sort of, well, as long as the people are nominated Lutheran, just let them have their little superstitions so we can get on with our lives?
Yeah. No, I think it's the latter rather than the former. There tend to be crackdowns, and then people forget. Partly because, although they're incredibly important to us as historians, maybe in sort of day-to-day things, the nuns weren't so important. So as long as the honor of your ducal house, which gave all this stuff, isn't going to be denigrated, so that it's okay. I mean, it's one of the reasons why these institutions survive is because these wealthy, noble families in the cities and in the countryside have given, and they don't necessarily want their gifts to be completely denigrated. This contributes in important ways. But at the same time, there is a certain amount, I have to say, in the 16th century, there's a certain amount of disingenuousness, too. I have one case of a visitation which came to a cloister in the north of Germany, and the visitors said to the nuns, "You must surrender to us the idol you've been worshiping." And the nuns say, "What idol have we been worshiping?" And they say, "Well, you know, you have this monstrance with the holy blood." And say, "Oh, we don't have anything like that." Now, had they hidden it away under the choir stalls or whatever and said, "We don't have anything like that"? Or did they really not have anything like that? Point one. But point two, why were the visitors asking particularly about, you know, a monstrance in which there was an idol? A certain amount of this is confiscation of valuable material, which is then you know, you get rid of the host in it or the blood relic or whatever, and then you take the elaborate container and you melt it down, and this contributes to your treasury. So there are all kinds of complicated motives going on at every stage. Why you might hide something. Did you hide it? Was it still there? Why are the visitors saying maybe it's there? And that's why I say, to some extent, these questions about survival, then you have to start researching, you know, local houses. Yeah.
I'm not in this field. I'm an outsider, but I'm fascinated. My question is this: if you look at it from the point of view of cooperative iconoclasm, not just, of course, within the Christian world and so on, is there an economic side? The change of meaning might be cheaper than building new worship objects in poor places.
Yeah, this is a very important observation, and there are two things that I'd like to say. One is that in terms of generally of comparative iconoclasm, one of the things that's really interesting about Protestant iconoclasm is how much it doesn't focus on icons or images. You know, I mean, in places where there's destruction, it's, I mean, as you know, I mean, in England, it's of altars and altar rails, and so it really is focused on the apparatus of a kind of Catholic worship, which is understood to be deeply threatening. So it's not iconoclasm in quite the way that, for example, one has in the Byzantine world. I mean, these iconoclasms are somewhat different. But now, but you were also asking about the economic implications, and this, you know, this absolutely is true. Formulate again. What was the second part of your question?
I think that sometimes
lost
changing
it.
of the meaning, like dressing,
Yeah.
is cheaper than than building all new systems.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I've forgotten the particular way in which you asked the question. Yes, and one of the things that's really interesting is if we look at the few places where, just to take Lutheran Germany, if we look at the few places where we had a new Lutheran church built, it tends to be very simple. Very simple, and the only object that is going to be elaborate will be the pulpit. And this is exactly what we would expect in the religion of the Word. So economics is absolutely crucial in that most of the time you are having what the architects call adaptive reuse. In other words, you're reusing what you've got. And that is one of the key things that's happening. But what this means is that one of the explanations for the medieval survival, the Catholic survival in Protestant realms, is not only economic and not even only social, in the sense that the aristocrats and the patriciate who endowed these things didn't want their investments to go away, particularly when they needed these as places to park supernumerary women. But it's not just that, it's also that in a situation where you have a dynamic where things go back and forth, so some of the explanation is political. And what happens is, a city will be Lutheran, and then it will be Calvinist, and then it will be Catholic, and then the Swedes would, tend to come down in war. And so it's not just for economic and social reasons, it's also for political reasons. You don't have a long enough time where you can really begin to consolidate architecturally and devotionally a change that you've tried to bring about theologically and in terms of legislation. So there's a certain amount of continuity. And there is obviously some change. I mean, some things are removed, but the very fact that we have, I just mentioned, we have not only in Lutheran Germany, but also in Lutheran Poland and Hungary, many more medieval vestments still used, still worn by the Protestant preachers than we have in Catholic areas. Where, you sort of rip them up and you sew them into other things and you bring in modern fabric and you've got a long consolidated tradition, so you could just keep on updating and getting rid of the stuff that's out of date. And you're quite right, for economic, social, and political reasons, you can't really get rid of what's out of date, and so you continue it, and it may be that your pastor or your theologian says, we can really continue it because it doesn't mean that much anyway, you can interpret it in a different way, but that's not how many people were reacting to it. Yeah, sorry, didn't see you before, yeah.
No, that's fine. This was as good as chestnuts. And thank you. Your final comments now about the continuity and the argument about material culture and objects telling a different story.
Yeah.
That actually chimes with, I think, the world. Actually, I'm thinking of a group that was here in the Institute 6 or 8 years ago with archaeologists dealing with questions with big narratives like occupation, say the Muslim occupation and then the Byzantine period in Palestine, and how they tell a completely different story than the one that is told by text. So that really, I think in history of art, that does not happen as often, but I think archaeologists are there doing that kind of work. But the question I want to ask is actually completely different. It has to do with the doctrine of indifference. Because the way I'm familiar with the question about the aphora, I'm familiar with from the debates of toleration.
Exactly.
Century, Pierre Bayle and Penn and Locke and so forth. The indifference is not about people's indifference. They actually care very seriously. It's that God doesn't care. So it's God's indifference.
That's interesting.
In which case, people can care deeply, but actually it doesn't really matter because in God's eyes, these are all parallel and similar, in which case it's quite different. And I wonder if in the 16th century it was actually meant as indifference of people. That's interesting. That's an interesting clarification. I think it's the indifference of the objects themselves, not either of the people or of God. In other words, the argument is that it's okay because they can be interpreted differently. They themselves are not sinister, say the way in the Byzantine iconoclasm controversy, the images themselves would be seen as sinister. And certainly Calvin thinks the images themselves are the problem. They are misleading people. In other words, it's not possible for people not to misinterpret the images. But Luther says, it'd be better, particularly if you don't have the Virgin Mary. But the objects themselves don't carry one theological message. And the same thing then is true. I mean, the first adiaphorus controversy is really about ritual. So the question then is, which ritual acts are indifferent in the sense that you can keep them because you can use them anyway? But that's interesting. Presumably also God is well, I don't know. God doesn't want you bowing down before the Virgin Mary, if you're Luther. On the other hand, of course, what you really have to do is, you have to accept the grace that's coming, which is not, and of course, then we have to put it in the whole context of Protestantism, which is not so much about text as it's about word, basically. So
almost in the simplest possible sense, if it's word that you're receiving, living word, then what it looks like is secondary.
Before we go to end here, I think the last thing we should say, thank Caroline for her wonderful talk. But really, so even if she says, what the least part of life here is indifferent. Indifferent to students, indifferent to teachers, indifferent to thinking about humanity. So we're very grateful for the celebration today, and thank you very much to all of you. And
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank
It was
you.
fantastic, really. Can I ask you, we have a tradition in